We're talking to Greg Moore. He has been many things, including the Chief of Staff to the New Hampshire House and Mr. Speaker Bill O'Brien, and is currently the State Director of Americans for Prosperity in New Hampshire. Good evening.
Good evening. Good to be on the show. Always an interesting time. People give a lot of backwards reflections after elections, and they try to rationalize what actually happened. It's always an interesting to hear how people's conventional wisdom changed after some people actually voted.
I'd like to get your 30,000-foot view of the primary on Tuesday. New Hampshire had a statewide primary on September 13th. That would be Tuesday, just passed. Lots of things happened. We had some really tight races, some blowouts. So what do you think?
Well, I think that first and foremost, one of the biggest takeaways is that it was a very low turnout. It's looking like the final number is going to be right around 110,000. That's historically very low. It speaks frankly to the fact that a lot of the oxygen is being sucked out of people's political views by this presidential race. The presidential race we're seeing is probably one of the noisiest ones we've seen in recent memory. Obviously, presidential races by their nature tend to be pretty vocal, but this one in particular has seemed to have the attention of a lot of people. And coming off of a record-setting presidential primary to see a historically low state primary, I think shows that people are thinking about November already.
Having been in the sausage factory here of politics in New Hampshire, of all places, for, I don't know, we're getting close to 10 years now. You know, most of the people that I talk to are very state-focused. You know, the people inside politics are very state-focused. They know that on the ground in New Hampshire, you can really make a big difference. And we've seen that in some of these races where important seats were lost or won by a handful of votes. So, and the other part of that I wanted to mention is you write about the presidentials. I was talking to a guy outside a polling place in Merrimack, and he's like, the turnout's pathetic, but he's like, I'm thinking about it. And he says, a lot of these Trump voters are people who were never registered before. A lot of them came out of the woodwork just to vote in the presidential, and they're not voting in the local races where we kind of, get our bread and butter as far as stories and all sorts of things. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that's obvious. The presidential primary is really just a case where a lot of there's a year build up, as you know. It's almost like it's not like an institution. It is an institution here in New Hampshire. There's so much money that's spent in terms of TV ads and voter contact, and so many campaigns that staff up to such a huge degree. Vastly more field staff than you'd see in a regular election here. So it's to be expected that we see that huge amount of turnout. But just looking at the Republican side, think about it for a second. There were close to 285,000 people who voted in February, and a lot of those people were first-time voters, and they were drawn into it largely because of an attraction to Donald Trump. And then we come down to the September state primary, and we're seeing 110,000. Obviously, that's far less than half of the people who voted just in February. And if people find it easier to go out, in a cold day in February than to go out on a beautiful day in September, that tells you a little bit about where people's minds are. And I think that the closeness of some of these races, it was largely driven by the hard work of the campaigns. And in particular, I want to give some credit to Congressman Frank Ginta and the work his staff did to build frankly what was probably the most effective ground game. And I think the way you can measure that, Steve, is just looking at the number of raw votes in the primary in the first congressional district versus the second congressional district. And when you're seeing 110,000, but over 60,000 of them are in one half of the state, that tells you that there was something going on in that half of the state. So to see the disparity between the first and the second congressional district tells you it really wasn't driven by a statewide phenomenon. It really was driven by Frank Ginta working hard to turn out his vote. And certainly one of the beneficiaries of that hard-working turnout that Congressman Ginta did was Chris Sununu, Executive Counselor Chris Sununu, because most of his district is located in the first congressional district. So it's highly possible that part of the reason why Chris Sununu was able to score a victory on Tuesday was largely because of the turnout that was being driven by Frank Inta in order to win his primary.
I haven't had a chance to look yet. Is there a disparity in the Democrat turnout versus the Republican turnout for New Hampshire?
Well, yeah, absolutely. The turnout was just over 60,000 on the Democratic side, but they didn't have much in the way of primaries beyond the governor's race here. So it really wasn't a case where you saw a real challenge with the Senate. It was going to be Governor Hassan was running unopposed. You saw Carol Shea Porter and Ann Custer were running unopposed. So they didn't have the multiple number of races that can pull people off the couch and to bring them in on election day.
So it's good to know they don't care that much about who runs for governor then, doesn't it?
well, and you got to give some credit to executive counselor Colin Van Ostern. Now, he spent a lot of money. He raised close to $1.2 million in advance of the primary, and he spent a good chunk of that. And he wanted to make sure he won. Obviously, he felt concerned by probably the fact that Mark Connolly has a long and distinguished history in state government, and Steve Marchand obviously was the guy trying to run as a Bernie Sanders type. And Van Ostern probably saw what happened with Bernie Sanders in February and said, I better get on my horse here and start riding hard. And he did. And so sometimes you have to show the respect and give the credit to the people who do run these substantially effective campaigns. And Colin Van Ostern did that to this point.
Any surprises in, like, say, the state senate or House races?
In hindsight, you certainly can see some of the things happening in advance before they actually do. But sometimes, particularly for the races that are more distant from the southern part of the state, some of the information you get tends to be a little spottier. So, for example, I'll suggest that I was hearing from a lot of activists up in Coos County who thought that Leon Rideout was going to win his Senate primary handily. Obviously, that didn't happen, and that's to the credit of Lucy McFall and the great campaign that she put together, Dottie McFall. And I think that was a case where not a lot of people down in the southern part of the state were expecting that. And you have to give credit to the people who run a strong race. And you saw that. I think a lot of other people weren't expecting the race between Ruth Ward and Jim Beard to be as close in the 8th Senate district on the Republican side. Mm-hmm. Same thing on the Democratic side in District 9 with Jeannie Deach running against Lee Nyquist. A lot of people thought that Nyquist, as a two-time nominee, was gonna run away with it, and that didn't happen. So you tend to look at these races after the fact, and you ask yourself, first of all, who are you counting on as far as the intelligence you're getting from inside the district, and if you miss something, you have to ask yourself, okay, what exactly did I miss, and how do I make sure I don't make that same mistake again? And certainly the most closely watched Senate race, it seems, was the race in Senate District 24, where Dan Innes ultimately prevailed in what many people thought was going to be what was going to be and ended up being one of the most vigorous primaries out there. Another one where some people across the state seemed to be surprised was in the Senate District 18 race, which is in Manchester and Litchfield, or parts of Manchester and Litchfield, where it appears at this point Ross Terrio has won by 5 votes over George Lambert. And I think that some folks didn't expect Ross to be as successful, but he did a good job of putting together a focus on Manchester. And now he's got the tough task of running against Donna Soucy, who's definitely a well-funded candidate and someone who's very close to the Democrat Party leadership. So she'll get a ton of their support.
So Sean Jasper survived.
Yeah. So Speaker Jasper was running in Hudson and Pelham, and certainly there were a number of folks who were either raising concerns about some of the things that happened in the House over the course of the last two sessions, particularly on the issue of expanding Medicaid and continuing Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, and a lot of the concerns that went along with that. And as well as there was a pact that did an independent expenditure that also actively advocated for Sean Jasper's defeat in the seat. And when you look back at those types of races, where you have these big jumbled primaries, it's a case in which all those folks who are running in those races have to run their own races, and people often lose sight of the fact that in order for someone to lose in one of these multi-candidate races, it means everybody else has to run a better race. So I think that sometimes people have these perceptions that these races are basically a thing unto themselves, and that's really not how it works. A lot of times when people have to vote for 11 candidates, they might vote for 3 or 4 and not use all of their votes. And so very often, it's up to each individual person, again, in these multi-candidate seats, to make the case for their campaign and say, listen, just give me one of your 11.
We had a similar circumstance here in Merrimack where we had a couple of people that I was really hoping to get rid of. In the end, we ended up with 3 pretty decent-looking Liberty conservative candidates, and a lot of the squishy moderates kind of made their way in, but they all had name recognition. They've all been around for a really long time. People recognize their name when they look on the ballot, so that has a lot of play. I think people who aren't used to these small-town elections and this small-town politics don't really understand the amount of weight that gets attached to that when you have, say, a town of 25,000 people with 16 to 18,000 registered voters. When over only a few thousand of them show up, the people who have name recognition are going to win.
Well, that's particularly true the further down the ballot you go. You certainly hope that most people who are running knew the names, or you'd hope, of the candidates running for governor or U.S. Senate or House of Representatives. As you go further down the ballot, it's definitely more and more of a challenge for people to be aware of all the candidates who are running. Frankly, if you're running and you have 8 or in my case in Bedford 6 or in Hunter and Pelham 11, it's hard to know and remember all the individuals who potentially are running for office. So it's a case where each candidate has an incumbent upon themselves to build up their name ID, and that's always a challenge.
All right, a couple things off the state side. I know that AFP New Hampshire and Americans for Prosperity in general are working on a couple of issues that will affect New Hampshire if we choose not to pay attention and not learn the lessons of not knowing who's who and what's what. And if people go to the AFP New Hampshire Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AFPNH, right in the front, big blue, says, "Tell Congress don't tax the internet."
Yeah, and there's an ongoing effort. Certainly there are a number of states across the country who say, how can I get some more money in without raising taxes on my citizens? And it's the old adage, tax not me, tax not thee, tax that fellow behind the tree. Mm-hmm. That whole philosophy is really what's driving the whole internet sales tax idea. And what it is this notion that in Washington, they want to pass a law to allow states to collect sales tax from the citizens who are buying products, who live in their state who are buying products from other states. Now there was a court ruling, and this was actually developed around the notion of catalog sales. And the argument of the people who are proposing this law change is the Internet's very different than catalog sales. But what the court ruling suggests is that the transaction takes place at the vendor's location and not at the buyer's location. And this would basically flip that notion so that the transaction would be considered to be at the buyer's location, meaning at their computer where they're buying something on the internet, and that would make the vendor responsible for collecting taxes for the whatever the state, the county, the municipality that has the sales tax, and then they'd be responsible for remitting that tax to the appropriate taxing authority. Now that really hurts New Hampshire because obviously we don't have a sales tax. A lot of retail operations like to come to New Hampshire and set up shop here because that gives them a competitive advantage to just sell stuff here. Think of companies like PC Connection and Merrimack and some of the other places that allows them to sell, frankly, in many cases, 5, 6, 7% less just by doing business in New Hampshire. And if you flip that so that suddenly the sales tax is now paid to where the place is sold, that's lost. And the idea here being that doing that will bring in more revenue to the state. The problem is that's a logistical nightmare, an absolute logistical nightmare for the businesses here in New Hampshire because there are almost 10,000 taxing authorities across the country charging sales tax. Some state, some county, some local, some even within localities. And try to keep tabs on them. What that forces is every single vendor now has to buy a product. Oh, one of the biggest supporters of the internet sales tax, Amazon, happens to have that product already in place. So guess what? If this internet sales tax took effect, Amazon would stand to gain a ton of money by selling their sales tax calculation software package. So frankly, that helps to understand why some of these big technology firms are pushing the internet sales tax, as well as state legislators. Former House Speaker Terry Norelli, when she was the head of the National Conference of State Legislators, was there when they made this one of their top priorities because, again, they feel like it's, quote, free money, close quote, even though the citizens of those states are not going to have to pay that tax. They act as if because the business is located in another state that suddenly people won't notice it or recognize it. It's just another backdoor way to try to raise taxes on people, and that's one of the reasons why we're fighting it.
I've had my differences with Senator Ayotte, but she's been really good on this issue. Is there anybody else in New Hampshire that's really for this? Because I can't see how this helps New Hampshire at all. If there's no tax advantage to being here, why even set up business in our borders?
Absolutely. We spend a lot of time talking about tax competitiveness. In fact, our sister organization, Americans for Prosperity Foundation, is actually going to be holding an event next Thursday on the 22nd in Manchester about the impact of the business tax reductions over the last 2 years. There's actually been 4 business tax reductions over the last 4 years. And since those tax reductions have been put in place and that New Hampshire has become more competitive, not only have jobs exploded across the state, but also our revenues have gone up. Not the $90 million hole that Governor Hatson suggested when she vetoed the budget last year. In fact, business tax revenues are up since this law has gone into effect, or these laws began to go into effect. Business tax revenues are up almost 17%. So it's a case where we're going to take the opportunity to talk about the policy and talk about the implications of cutting business taxes for the purposes of making the state more competitive. Because I know you and your readers know because they tend to be a very, very informed crowd. But prior to these business tax reductions, New Hampshire had the 3rd highest business tax rate in the country. That's
one of those statistics that I keep coming back to over and over again whenever I'm writing about it because it's so true. All right, we're just about out of time. How can people contact you if they want to help out or whatever?
If anyone wants to come onto our website, it's afp-nh.com. It's the easiest way to get to our website. They can find us on Facebook and find us on Twitter. There are opportunities for people to get involved and get engaged. Again, if they want to get involved in that breakfast, that business roundtable luncheon next Thursday, they should check out our sister organization, Americans for Prosperity Foundation, afp-nh, on Facebook, and they can sign up there.
Well, Greg Moore, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve.
All right, you have a great night.